Welcome, everybody. I'm Judd Newborn. I served as founding historian of New York's Holocaust Museum, the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And today, among other things, I'm a dramatic multimedia lecturer, often on themes relating unique stories of the Holocaust to today's most compelling issues. Now, I'm substituting as host for Olivia Mattis, the prodigious president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and for a wonderful reason. Olivia is in Jerusalem for the dedication of a city square to Aristides de Sousa Mendes, a great accomplishment on her part and that of the foundation itself. The Sousa Mendes Foundation, of course, honors a hero and rescuer who, against orders, saved thousands of refugees struggling to escape the Nazi onslaught in his role as the Portuguese Consul General of Bordeaux, France. For these actions, he paid a high price. Today's program deals with the story of the ocean liner St. Louis, but from a different angle than usual. The St. Louis, of course, was packed with nearly 1,000 German Jewish refugees who were infamously refused entry into Cuba and the United States and Canada. It's a tragic story, but it has two saving graces. Fewer people know that the ship's German captain, Gustav Schroeder, working with Morris Troper of the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, actually managed to arrange relatively safe haven for the passengers in 4 European countries. Although many did perish later, a portion of those Jews did also survive. One of them is our distinguished guest, Dr. Hans Fischer. Born in Breslau, Germany, Dr. Fischer is Professor Emeritus of Rutgers University, specializing in biochemistry and rising to the university's highest positions over the course of his career. He's lectured at Harvard Medical School, among many other institutions. Dr. Fischer finally reached New York with his father just 2 weeks before his bar mitzvah. Our other distinguished guest, Scott Miller, will open the program by talking about Captain Schroeder, who was honored by Yad Vashem, and about Morris Troper. Scott Miller is co-author of Refuge Denied, the St. Louis Passengers and the Holocaust. Scott served as U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Director of Curatorial Affairs, overseeing the museum's vast collection in every medium. Today, he is a wide-ranging curator, consulting for many institutions, including New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage. And just an aside, here's a heads up. You won't want to miss next Sunday's revelatory program, especially with the rise of anti-Semitism today. I'll tell you more about that program later. But now, I'm going to turn the floor over to Scott, who will then hand it over to Hans. So Scott, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Judd, and thank you to the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And I also want to say at the outset that all the photos and documents that I'll be showing my PowerPoint are from the archives of either the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., or the archives of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee in New York City. So what do we mean when we talk about the unsung heroes of a story such as the St. Louis, such a tragic story, such a story of really senseless tragedy? In what way were there heroes, as Judd mentioned, in the persons of Captain Schroeder and Morris Troper of the Joint Distribution Committee? Well, just to go back a little bit in time to the 1990s, I did a project with a coworker at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, Sarah Ogilvie. We did a project to trace the fate of every passenger who was on the St. Louis. This was what became of the passengers was really an unsolved mystery for 50, 60 years. And as we did our research, we realized that the majority of St. Louis passengers survived the war. And we asked ourselves how that was. Most people, including many of the passengers themselves, always believed that the majority perished, were killed. So when we started sort of unpacking the story, we realized that Captain Schroeder, acting alone, and Morris Troper, acting with his organization, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, were in a certain way responsible for many more passengers surviving than we thought, and in a certain way, making the story of the St. Louis in some way a rescue story. Not as much as a rescue story as it should have been, but certainly more than people thought. And I'd like to now show you a short video actually produced by the curatorial department at the Holocaust Museum, which will review in very broad strokes the story of the St. Louis, and also focus on one of our unsung heroes, Morris Troper.
I'm Susie Snyder. I am a curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in the Division of Art and Artifacts. The Morris Troper collection is actually an archival collection that we received around 2005. It's significant because Morris Troper was a very important figure in an event that took place in June of 1939. This was the end of the event that we'll be discussing, and it is a picture of passengers surrounding Morris Troper that were on the MS St. Louis. In May of 1939, more than 900 passengers boarded the ship, mainly Jewish passengers, most of who've had quota numbers to eventually enter the United States. They boarded the ship hoping to sail at least to Cuba, where they could await entry to the United States. They felt safer if they were in South America or in a country that wasn't occupied by the Nazis. En route to Cuba from Hamburg, Germany, where the ship set sail, it was decided that the passengers were not going to be able to disembark in Havana. The Cuban government made this decision because it was found that illegal landing permits were sold to the Jewish population of the ship. This created quite a problem for the Jewish passengers because they did not want to return to Germany. Many negotiations began. The Joint Distribution Committee stepped in and tried to assist in having other countries take the passengers. The Joint Distribution Committee was an organization that worked on behalf of the Jewish community. He worked for the Joint Distribution Committee as a representative in Paris. He was assigned to go to meet the ship. He worked with the passengers and the passenger committee. The passenger committee really worked between the captain and the passengers to let the passengers know what was going on a day-to-day basis. The theory was that if Morris Troper could negotiate the landing of the 900 some odd passengers in countries other than Germany, those four countries being the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, they would be secure. A year later, Germany overran 3 of those countries. The passengers who once thought they were safe were no longer safe. Archival material that's included in the Morris Troper collection are papers, telegrams, little notes that were jotted down and given to Morris Troper or the representatives who were trying to divide the passengers up. The telegrams actually are going between representatives of the Joint Distribution Committee and officials in the United States. In the telegrams, you can see that there is some desperation and that every option is being explored. In some cases, passengers would ask if they could go to a specific location because they had a loved one there or because they were a large family and they wanted to be together. This is where it becomes particularly poignant and moving, seeing these notes and seeing the gratitude that these passengers felt for Morris Troper. These people end up perishing. Arthur Bleckman had written this note asking to go to France. He, his wife, and child ended up going to Belgium. He was deported and he perished. His wife and child survived. His child survived in hiding. This man, Mr. Hirsch, was a cantor. He and his wife and child disembarked in the Netherlands. They all perished. He wrote a note and sent photographs to Morris Troper after they had temporarily settled in the Netherlands. The thing that I think is the most interesting about this collection is it's so useful to look back and see how can the information in this collection really enhance what we already know. It's getting a different viewpoint. We have collections that we received before Morris Troper's papers where we have one side of the story from the perspective of a survivor who was on the ship. His family fled Germany aboard the St. Louis. They ended up being forced to disembark in the Netherlands. Leopold Dingfelder and his wife and Rudy were all deported to Auschwitz eventually from the Netherlands. Only Rudy survived multiple concentration camps. Eventually, Rudy's wife, in the late 90s, donated a collection of materials that told us Rudy's story. We even had concentration camp documentation. What it didn't tell us was what his father and mother's plans were for their future. In Troper's collection, many years later, we found this napkin, which states there was serious intent from Leopold Dingfelder, his father, to get into the United Kingdom so they could be secured. In the end, you see Morris Troper on board the ship, surrounded by passengers who seem relieved. They're going to a safe haven. For me, looking at the photograph, it's very hard because I know the outcome. I know there are people in that photograph who don't survive.
Okay, so I'm going to just turn now, we'll return to Morris Troper in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to turn now to our other unsung hero, and that is Captain Schroeder. And if we could have the first slide. This is Captain Gustav Schroeder, who was the captain of the St. Louis. And what makes him so extraordinary is that he told his crew, there were 231 crew members on the St. Louis, most of whom were members of the Nazi Party, that he told his crew that these passengers, knowing they were Jewish, were to be treated like all other Germans, with all the other courtesies awarded to German citizens. And this was an astounding thing, and perhaps even a dangerous thing, a risky thing to say at the late date of 1939. And if we go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, the St. Louis set sail on May 13th, 1939. Captain Schroeder not only helped many of the elderly passengers carry their luggage onto the ship, he understood the pulse of the passengers. The passengers were emotionally torn leaving Germany. Though they were happy to be leaving to what they thought was freedom, it was also very bittersweet. Germany was their home for many generations for most of the passengers. And Captain Schroeder realizes, he even wrote in his diary about the anxiety of the passengers. And he even set up a makeshift synagogue for the passengers in one of the ballrooms. And late Friday afternoon before Shabbat, covered the bust of Hitler and the Nazi flag with cloth. He really did all in his power to make the journey comforting and comfortable for the passengers. And as well, on May 23rd, en route to Cuba, there was an elderly passenger, Morris Troper, who died of a heart attack. Captain Schroeder sat with his widow, Rachel Weiler, and made sure that when Morris Troper was buried at sea, that he was not buried in a swastika, that was the custom, but rather in the insignia of the Hamburg America line. Also on this day, May 23rd, Captain Schroeder received a telegram from the Hamburg America line, which was the line of the St. Louis, letting them know that there's going to be trouble, or there might be trouble when the passengers arrive at Cuba, because the decree which enabled the St. Louis passengers to obtain landing permits to be tourists in Cuba and be able to stay there, that decree was annulled. And it wasn't clear whether the St. Louis passengers would be able to disembark. Captain Schroeder kept his calm, was determined, and sailed on to Cuba, and also set up a passenger committee. He didn't want to cause panic among the passengers, so he just told around 5 or 6 members, 5 or 6 passengers that were sort of an advisory committee to him. And May 27, the St. Louis arrived in Havana. And if we could have the next slide. What took place was not what was expected. The passengers were told that they could not disembark. They were told by Cuban police they could disembark tomorrow. They kept hearing the word mañana, which was the first Spanish word that many of the passengers heard. But as one of the passengers said, mañana never came. There was no tomorrow. What took place on the tomorrow, which was Sunday, May 28th, was that many of the passengers who had relatives either living in Havana or who had been living in the United States flew down to Havana to greet them, or so they thought they'd be greeting them. Their relatives really rented these little boats, that one you see in front of you, and sailed out to the St. Louis to desperately try to see if they could see their relatives and to wave to them. You see the next photo. This is the mirror image of the photo you just saw of passengers waving to family members. They didn't know it at the time, but for many of them, it would be the last time they would ever see their family members. And at this moment, on this very day, May 28th, the day after the St. Louis passengers arrived, the Joint Distribution Committee, which I'll call save a lot of time, the JDC. For the next couple of minutes, the JDC sent a representative down to Havana, Lawrence Berenson, with very good relations with the Cuban government and the Cuban business community to negotiate on behalf of the passengers, to plead with the Cuban government to let them in. And in fact, Berenson made an offer to pay for the passengers. The Cuban government wanted $500 a head, which was almost $500,000 in total. And negotiations went on, and eventually when Berenson made a counter offer, Laredo Brew, who's the president of Cuba, broke off the negotiations. You know, when people ask, couldn't the JDC have just paid immediately the $500,000? And you have to understand that the Joint Distribution Committee at this point in Jewish history was really, in a certain way, the benefactor of beleaguered Jewish communities throughout the world. They were supporting Jews in transit in dozens of countries. They were supporting the Jewish community directly in Germany since 1933. They were spread very thin. Negotiations broke off. And on June 2nd, Captain Schroeder really had no choice but to leave Cuban waters. He sailed very slowly. He was determined and committed to not bringing the ship back to Germany and to giving the JDC perhaps more time to try to negotiate. And he sailed slowly to the coast of Miami Beach, so tantalizingly close to the shores of this beautiful city that the passengers could see the palm trees and the hotels and the sand on the beach. And Captain Schroeder thought that the Americans might let the St. Louis in because most of the passengers, 734 of them, actually had waiting numbers to get into the United States. So they were refugees with paperwork. They weren't even what today we call boat people. They were people on a boat, but they were not boat people. They actually had their paperwork to get into the United States. It was a matter of letting them in early. And after 5 days, the passengers received a telegram from the State Department saying that the passengers would have to wait their turn until their numbers came up and have to leave American shore. And that's what took place on June 6th. The ship began to sail slowly back to Europe. And Captain Schroeder and the Joint Distribution Committee were in tight contact, together with an intergovernment committee on refugees, as well as even some members of the State Department. And a deal was brokered, really because of the hard work of the JDC and Captain Schroeder, with 4 European countries, and you just heard this in the film clip that you just saw, other than Germany, to take in the passengers: France, Belgium, Holland, and England. And that was considered the happy ending to the story. On June 17, 1939, the passengers disembarked in Antwerp rather than back in Hamburg. And the fact that, of course, we have, in hindsight, we know that 3 out of those 4 countries were invaded by the Nazis. But again, lives were saved by the fact that they did not have to go directly back to Germany. And it was also, it's a great example of very different bodies working together, cooperating. Captain Schroeder, as well as the JDC, primarily Morris Troper, who was head of the European operations for the JDC. And if we can go to the next slide. This is, in fact, even a letter that Captain Schroeder wrote in English to Morris Troper. And I'll just read part of it very quickly. Thanking Troper. Before I leave Antwerp, I take the opportunity to, hold on, I have to, sorry about that. I take the opportunity to thank you once more sincerely for the cooperation we have received from you personally in the different committees in organizing so efficiently the distribution of the passengers, and with this helping to arrange their disembarkation so speedily. I'm sure with a satisfactory ending, I join the passengers with my personal thanks and appreciation for all you have done. Sincerely, Gustav Schroeder, Captain of the St. Louis. And as you know, as we did research to try to trace the fate of all the passengers, we came, this is mainly in the archives of the JDC in New York. If we go to the next slide, we came across dozens of documents similar to the ones you saw today that the JDC was tracking the St. Louis passengers. They were a very high-profile group of refugees to make sure that they were safe. And I have to add that the JDC paid $500,000 to ensure their safe haven in these 4 European countries. This money, the $500,000, was allocated to provide for their welfare and to send them monthly checks. And not only that, and this is really where the St. Louis, the JDC were rescuers, they actually sent the St. Louis passengers when their waiting number would finally come up. Remember, I said most of the passengers had waiting numbers. A lot of the passengers, the waiting numbers came up in late 39, 40, into 41. The JDC would let the passengers know that their waiting number would come up. It's not like today where you get, you know, an email or a call on your cell phone that your waiting number came up, or not even a fax. None of this existed. It was the Joint Distribution Committee that was in a race against the clock to let the passengers know when their numbers came up. So in a certain way, because of what I'm describing now, this sort of tilted the scale in favor of survival for this particular group of refugees caught up in the Holocaust. Now, of course, as we'll go to the next slide. If I can, you can see the man circled in red. That's Morris Troper. He was extremely engaged, as was Captain Schroeder. He was extremely engaged with the passengers. He even went on board and greeted them when the ship arrived at Antwerp in June. And here he is with a lot of the children of the St. Louis. And in the next slide, you can see him with one family in particular. This is Joseph, who was head of the passenger committee, with his wife Lily and his daughter Liesel. Liesel, the Josephs survived the war. They settled in Philadelphia. Liesel just died a few years ago. Liesel gave Captain Schroeder a bouquet of flowers and wrote him a note in German. She didn't know English at the time, thanking him for what he did. Troper was in this way a true hero. Troper had been involved in the JDC since 1920. He made numerous trips to Hungary and Poland and the Soviet Union in the 1920s, where the JDC was supporting communities, beleaguered communities, impoverished communities, and went to Berlin right in 1933 upon Hitler's rise to power. He was in Berlin on Kristallnacht. He was an eyewitness, and eventually the JDC, their Office for European Operations, which had been in Berlin, had to move to Paris under Troper's leadership. And then 10 hours before in 1940, before the Germans invaded Paris, they moved to Lisbon. He really was in a constant race against the clock, moved very quickly, and in so doing was able to save the lives of hundreds of St. Louis passengers. So, of course, there were many cases where the Joint Distribution Committee just, you know, couldn't, it's not that they couldn't move in time, but their rescue just could not come in time. I don't want to give the impression that they were able to rescue the entire ship. 254 passengers were killed in the Holocaust. But in this photo, you see a group of children who were all in the St. Louis. They were in hiding in an Osé children's home. Osé was a Jewish child's welfare organization in France. And the JDC had some connections and relations with the Osé home, but these were children really in hiding, and it was very hard to stay in touch. Many of the Osé homes were raided, even if the JDC was in touch with them, and children were deported to Auschwitz. On that photo, is the photo up? Yeah, that we just saw. The little boy, second from the left, with the harmonica. he received that his name is Horst Rotholz. He was on the St. Louis. He received that harmonica as a Hanukkah present in December 1942, and we think this is some kind of little Hanukkah presentation. It's a month later, in January 1943, Horst was deported to Auschwitz. So, of course, not all the rescue could come in time. And I just want to conclude with the following two sort of tribute photos to our rescuers. The next photo, this is unsung hero Morris Troper, who died in 1962. He really gave his life to the Jewish people. And in the next photo, and with this I'll conclude, is Captain Schroeder was recognized posthumously as a rescuer, as a righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem. It was really that it was the St. Louis passengers after the war, those who survived, who really, well, they supported Captain Schroeder financially, because the voyage of the St. Louis, I believe, was his last voyage, and they really brought his story to the world. In 1957, a year before he died, the German government did award him, the West German government, the Merit of Honor, but it wasn't until 1993 that Captain Schroeder was actually recognized by Yad Vashem. And in the photo that you just saw were some of the St. Louis passengers pointing to his name on the wall of rescuers. They planted a tree in his honor. And this is one of the greatest honors that can be bestowed to a rescuer, is have a tree planted at Yad Vashem. So I'm going to conclude now. And with great honor, I'm going to turn the floor over to a Holocaust survivor and survivor of the St. Louis and a friend of mine, Hans Fischer.
Thank you, Scott. This is a very interesting and complex and complicated story. What you're going to hear from me is very different. I was 11 years old when I got onto the St. Louis. But the story of the St. Louis for me actually began on November 10th, 1938, the morning after Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, when the Nazis broke the store windows of Jewish-owned institutions and stores and arrested about 30,000 Jewish men. I was at home, and suddenly the doorbell rang, and two Gestapo agents came and very politely asked for my father. And when my father came, they told him that they had been authorized to take him along and that he was going to go to a concentration camp. And he went to Buchenwald concentration camp on the 10th of November, 1938. But my mother, the minute he was picked up, called his best friend, who was a lawyer, and he came over to our apartment and looked through my father's documents, and he found the papers which showed that my father had been an officer in the German army in World War I. And based on his service in the German army in World War I, the Gestapo released my father in early January 1939 with a proviso that he leave Germany within 2 weeks. And so my father left on January 19th, 1939 on a boat for New York. And in New York, he was able to get a visa to enter Cuba. And that is really the reason why my mother, my sister, and I ended up on the St. Louis because my father was in Havana. And so we left on the St. Louis on May 13th, 1939. And you already heard, the passengers were not permitted to get off. There are all kinds of explanations why we were not let off. To me, the most meaningful explanation is that the Cuban immigration director, a man named Benitez, had kept the money that the passengers had paid for permission to get off in Cuba. Roughly 1,000 passengers, they paid somewhere between $300 and $400. So we're talking about $300,000 to $400,000. And Mr. Benitez kept this money. And the president of Cuba only found out that the money had not gone into the Cuban treasury when the boat was already on its way to Havana. And he called Benitez and asked for a cut of the money, whereupon Benitez took the next boat from Havana to Miami, never to return, and of course, never to return any of the money. And then you heard already that a Joint Distribution Committee lawyer by the name of Berenson came to Havana to negotiate with President Bru to see if they couldn't arrange to let the Cubans in. And the story that I believe is that Berenson offered so little money that Bru was insulted and stopped negotiating with Berenson, with the result that the passengers were never permitted to get off in Cuba. And then you heard the ship started on its way back by way of first stopping for a couple of days off the coast of Florida. I remember seeing Florida until the Coast Guard chased the boat out into international waters. And then the boat eventually slowly made its way back to Europe. Captain Schroeder, as you heard, was a great guy. He had vouched not to take the boat back to Germany. He had plans to scuttle it off the coast of Scotland. Fortunately, didn't have to get to that because Morris Troper from the Joint Distribution Committee had arranged with the Belgian government to get the Belgian government to agree to let a quarter of the passengers come into Belgium. And so the boat landed in Antwerp. Everybody got off. The passengers that were assigned to Belgium took a train and went to the capital of Belgium, and the passengers for Holland went to Amsterdam, and the passengers that were assigned to England and France transshipped onto another boat, which included my mother, my sister, and me. We ended up in France in a small town called Laval, and we were in Laval from June until about sometime in November of 1939, by which time World War II was already underway. It had started on September 1st, 1939, and we were lucky. My father in Havana was able to get us visas again to come to Cuba. The problem at this point was to find a boat from Europe to Havana. Eventually, towards the end of November of 1939, there was a French boat that was filled with Spanish refugees because the Spanish Civil War was just over. And my mother, my sister, and I, and a couple of others from the St. Louis were a very tiny minority on this French boat. All the others were Spaniards. And we first went to England, Southampton, waited until a convoy of, I was told, close to 200 ships assembled, and under guard of 2 British warships, all these boats made their way to New York, and not a single one was sunk by a German U-boat submarine from this group of boats. And we got to New York. My mother, my sister, and I were put on Ellis Island for a few days till there was a boat from New York to Havana. And finally, in January, towards the end of January 1940, we arrived in Havana and were reunited with my father. We stayed in Havana for about a year and were able to get papers to come to the United States in February of 1941. We came to New York and were in New York for a few months. And then my father was able to get a mortgage on a farm in New Jersey, in Vineland, New Jersey, from a Jewish philanthropic organization. And so we moved to Vineland, New Jersey, which is near Atlantic City. And that's where I went to high school. I was lucky. I had some very good teachers, and I learned English rapidly. And I was actually the valedictorian of my 600-strong class in Vineland High School. And based on that, I got a fellowship to go to Rutgers as an undergraduate. From there, I went to the University of Connecticut, got a master's degree there, and from there to the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and I got a doctorate degree there in nutritional biochemistry. So that's essentially the experience that I had, and we were very lucky in that we escaped the terrible hardships. We were lucky that Captain Schroeder was such a decent guy who would not take the boat back to Germany, which would have probably meant the end of every one of us. And of course, Morris Troper, who arranged with the Belgian government. I really think the Belgian government also deserves a lot of credit. Our Congress did express thanks to the Belgian government some years ago when we met with members of the US State Department, when the ambassador from Belgium was honored by the US government for having broken the ice and permitted a quarter of the passengers to come to Belgium, whereupon then England, France, and Holland also agreed to each take a quarter of the passengers. Okay, I will stop here and turn this meeting over to the representative of the Sousa Mendes organization that will tell you about some of the upcoming programs.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Hans, Scott, that was wonderful. I want to just tell you that we're going to continue. You can continue posting your questions in the chat box. There are two terrific programs coming up as we end this year's season. You won't want to miss next Sunday's revelatory and essential story, especially given the dangerous rise of anti-Semitism now in America. After viewing an Academy Award-nominated film whose director will be with us, along with expert Barbara Wind and the famous Abe Foxman of the ADL, you'll discover the inspiring story of a little woman, Sister Rose Thiering, who accomplished something tremendous, taking on the patriarchy of the Catholic Church and its age-old elements of anti-Semitic dogma. That's Sister Rose, who was behind the famed Nostra Aetate, the 1965 Vatican II Council's last-minute papal encyclical, finally declaring that Jews were not responsible for the death of Jesus and rejecting hatred, persecutions, and displays of anti-Semitism at any time by anyone. So, given what's happening today, I think we really need to hear about this unsung story and this extraordinary Sister Rose. Now, the season's program ends on December 4th, and that will be a heartwarming and uplifting program about a Jewish couple, Gilbert and Eleanor Krauss, who dared travel to a rabidly anti-Semitic Vienna in 1939 after the Anschluss with Germany to save 50 Jewish children from a near certain death. We have a generous anonymous donor to thank who'll be making it possible for those who need assistance to attend. Now, we're going to see a great Charlie Rose clip about our Sister Rose.
It's that time of the year. Academy Awards are upon us. This year, 5 films received Oscar nominations for the documentary short film category. Among them is Sister Rose's Passion. It is the true story of a fearless nun dedicated to changing the way Catholics see Jews. Here's a look at the film.
At one time, my father and I were driving through Plain, and he whispered to me, "We have a new pharmacist, and I think he's Jewish." And I said, "Daddy, why did you whisper that?" And I didn't get an answer from my father. And then I asked my mother, "Who are the Jews?" "Why is that?" "Because I read here that the Jews killed Christ, killed Jesus. And who are the Jews?" Well, she told me again, they are the people that killed Jesus. And that was in my books. And then I said, "Why can't Jews get to heaven? Why do you ask me? It says here that the Jews have to wander around the face of the earth without a homeland of their own. Why can't they get to heaven?" "Because they killed Jesus."
Joining me now is the film's director and producer, Oren Jacoby. I am pleased to have him to talk about this rather remarkable film. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, John.
How did you find out about Sister Rose?
It's an incredible story. It's every filmmaker's dream to find a character that's a great character, and even better, a story that hasn't been told. And I was very lucky. Some other filmmakers, Steve Califer, Peter LeDun, Kelly Pfeiffer, 3 filmmakers from New Jersey, knew Sister Rose, knew what a great story she would make for a documentary, and approached me about working with them to make this film. And I have to confess, at first I was a little reluctant. I heard a story about an elderly woman. She's a professor emerita at Seton Hall University, but doesn't get out as much as she used to. And then I met her, and I realized what a powerhouse she was, and how determined she was, and what a extraordinary soul she really is, because she's a woman with incredible determination, and a woman who, when she recognized that there was something about the faith that she devoted her life to, that she cared really deeply about more than anything, and that bothered her as seeming to be something unjust, she had to do something about it. And when I got that sense of her story, I had to do the film.
So you've been putting in your questions, and I'm going to try to work through them a little bit. Let's see. Give me a second. I guess we'll start with acknowledging that there are people in the audience who have personal connections to the St. Louis story, like Hans, some whose relatives were survived, another whose family members were saved, a reunion of survivors in 1989. Here's a question, I guess, for Scott, about possibilities of being saved or accepted into certain countries. The video that was shown earlier, someone asks, that's presumably the Canadian film clip, showed a newspaper headline that Dominica was willing to take the passengers. Is that the case?
Well, the Dominican Republic, my understanding was that the Dominican Republic also wanted an exorbitant amount from the St. Louis or from the JDC to settle the passengers there. And my understanding is that Lawrence Berenson thought this was like extortion, that a lot of countries were going to start, asking for this exorbitant amount. And Berenson was, trying to get the best deal that they could to save lives, and but still enable to to save the JDC money, to enable them to do the work that they were doing around the world. It's very complicated in terms of, people ask, well, couldn't Captain Schroeder have sailed to the Bahamas or to other countries? I mean, they were limited in terms of their food and fuel. They weren't planning on this. And it was logistically very complicated. And I do want to add, you mentioned before the upcoming program in a few weeks on Gilbert and Eleanor Krauss, who went to Nazi Germany to rescue Jewish children. I just can't help but add that they brought those children back to the United States on a ship, 50 children. And the day that ship landed, and there are photos of the ship with the children waving and the Statue of Liberty in the background, that date was June 5th, 1939, which was the last day that the St. Louis was languishing off the coast of Miami Beach. And just the contrast of what this couple did, for no recompense, and brought these children over with really the inability of the State Department to come up with any solution for the St. Louis passengers. It's just stunning. They were happening at the same time.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, a question for Hans. Hans, did you see the lights of Miami? Do you recall that? Did you experience that? And then there's another question.
Yes, I did. I absolutely saw it. And I saw the Coast Guard boat, and one of the officers on the Coast Guard boat had one of these big horns, and tried to alert the officers on the St. Louis, and eventually did, and told them that they had to get out of US waters and go out into international waters. And that was really the beginning of the trip back. If I may, I would like to add something to the previous question about the Canadian film. I'm sitting here in my little library, and I noticed that right behind me, there is a history book by an Israeli historian by the name of Vital, V-I-T-A-L. The book is called A People Apart, and it's a history of the Jews from somewhere in the 1800s to 1939. And in that book, he quotes the Prime Minister of Canada as having said, in response to the request by the passengers from the St. Louis to be permitted to enter Canada, under no circumstances should we let these Jews in, and this is a famous phrase, lest they pollute our Canadian blood. I've always shuddered, but always remembered this sentence in this history book.
That's to make one shudder. It's disgusting. Another question for Scott. What happened to Captain Schroeder afterwards? We know that he was eventually awarded the Yad Vashem, Righteous of the Gentiles, but what about when he came back to Germany? How was he treated by the Germans? And also, well, let's start with that. How was he treated by the Germans when he came back?
I mean, he wasn't persecuted per se. It's not clear. I've read conflicting accounts whether he had one more voyage after that, but then but soon after the St. Louis, he was retired to a desk job, and the St. Louis itself was destroyed in Allied bombing raids later in the war, and Captain Schroeder wrote a memoir after the war, Homeless at Sea, about the St. Louis experience. And a lot of St. Louis passengers got in touch with him after the war. Some of them actually testified in his behalf because during the process of denazification in Germany, he was actually, because he worked for Hamburg America Line, he was put on some type of tribunal, a trial by the Americans, and he was let off because passengers testified in his behalf of what he tried to do for them. I believe many St. Louis passengers actually supported him financially during the 1950s, and he died in 1958 in relative obscurity.
But at least he must have gotten together with the St. Louis passengers, right, who survived?
Yes, he did have contacts with them, absolutely.
Yes, yes. Okay, well, I'm thinking that our time is getting tight, and we want to invite each of our guests to have a chance to make some final comments. So let's see, we usually go in the other directions. Let's start with Hans now for some final thoughts. Hans?
Well, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a very complex story. Fortunately, we were fortunate enough that there was a Captain Schroeder and that there was a JDC. And also, I think we must give credit to the Belgian government to have broken the ice, to agreed to take some of the passengers, which then led France, England, and Holland to do likewise. So fortunately, that is what happened. Unfortunately, so often when these terrible things happen, people just dump on top of the misery and the terrible events instead of helping out. And so things often get worse rather than better. We are very lucky that in this case, so many of my fellow passengers were able to survive.
Thank you very much, Hans. That's excellent. And Scott, your final thoughts, and I'm wondering whether or not there's any lesson for today.
Yes, there is a lesson for today. There are two lessons for today. One that maybe or hopefully is obvious to people that, you know, individual actions have individual consequences. The actions or inactions of people at the State Department had individual consequences on the fate of the St. Louis passengers, as well as hundreds of thousands of Jews swept up in the Holocaust. But yet the individual actions of Morris Troper and his colleagues at the JDC, as well as Captain Schroeder, also had happier consequences. Actions matter. But more specifically in terms of today, I would just end my thoughts by saying, be kind to refugees. I think that's a lesson we have to learn, whether they're on boats in the Mediterranean, there have been many deaths, or at the southern border of the United States. These are people in desperate need. Different situation, not comparing it to the St. Louis passengers, but be kind to them.
Well, That's a beautiful and a very pertinent thought. I agree, we need to be kind to the refugees because that's what this foundation is about, rescue and resistance as well. Well, I want to thank you both, Hans and Scott, and everyone for spending this hour with us. Now, please do sign up before it's too late for next week's Sister Rose program. There's just so many people that can be accommodated, but we'll be glad to see you there. And also, of course, at the program about the Krause couple, which is going to be enlightening and uplifting. So we need a heartwarming end of the season program, and I think you'll enjoy that a great deal. So everybody, we'll see you next time. And on behalf of Olivia and the Susan Mendez Foundation, I want to thank all of our guests and all of you attending and say bye-bye.